Jessica's laughter cut through the afternoon air, sharp and contemptuous, as she pointed a carefully manicured finger at a black man standing quietly by a roadside beverage cart. "Look, honey," she hissed, her voice dripping with derision. "Probably waiting for his welfare check to clear." Her husband, Mark, smirked, draping an arm around her shoulder. "At least he knows his place." They had no idea that in less than an hour, their meticulously planned future would depend entirely on the man they were so gleefully scorning. Before we uncover the devastating consequences of this moment, take a second to like this video and subscribe to our channel. If you believe that character is the true measure of a person, then this is a story you need to hear to the very end. The California sun cast an unforgiving light on the pavement, a light that tolerated no imperfections. Jessica felt its heat through the silk of her blouse, but it didn't bother her. If anything, it made her feel more powerful. She and Mark were on their way to Innovatech Dynamics, a name synonymous with success, innovation, and, most importantly, money. The Vice President of Market Strategy position wasn't just a step up. It was a confirmation of everything Jessica believed she deserved. Mark, with the project director role he was targeting, was the perfect complement to that picture. They were a power couple, destined to conquer Silicon Valley, one deal at a time. They had parked 2 blocks away to avoid the exorbitant garage fees, a small act of thrift that Mark called fiscally prudent. As they walked, the heels of Jessica's shoes clicked a decisive rhythm on the concrete, each tap a declaration of her confidence. It was then that her eyes caught the man. He stood alone by a humble beverage cart, the kind with a metal body that gleamed under the sun. He wore a faded grey hoodie and a pair of worn-out jeans. His sneakers had seen better days, long ago. He was holding a bottle of water, the cheapest kind, and quietly watching the traffic flow by. To Jessica, he was an eyesore, a dissonant note in the symphony of ambition surrounding them. His very existence, in his simple attire, on the doorstep of one of the world's biggest tech companies, was an absurdity, and that absurdity struck her as funny. Her laugh escaped, unguarded. It wasn't a laugh of joy. It was a weapon, honed by years of believing in her own superiority. "Look, honey," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss, but loud enough for Mark to hear. Her nod was subtle, but loaded with meaning. "Probably waiting for his welfare check to clear." Mark followed her gaze. A smirk, almost a sneer, played on his clean-shaven face. He didn't need to say much. He understood Jessica's worldview, because it was also his. The world was divided into 2 types of people: winners, like them, and the rest. The man by the cart clearly belonged to the latter. "At least he knows his place," Mark replied, his tone reinforcing her contempt. He looped his arm through hers, a possessive gesture, an affirmation that they were of the same class, the same world, a world the other man could never touch. They walked past him, close enough to hear the faint crackle as he unscrewed the cap of his water bottle. They didn't look at him. They didn't need to. In their minds, he was already dismissed, categorized, and filed away in a box labeled irrelevant. He was a fleeting backdrop to their success story, a minor detail to remind themselves how far they'd come and how many they had surpassed. They saw their actions as a harmless pastime, a private joke between them to strengthen their bond and their sense of self-worth. They were oblivious to the fact that those words, spoken in arrogance, were not just sounds that dissipated into the air. They were seeds, and they were about to sprout in the last place they ever expected. The man, David, heard the laughter. He heard the words, however quietly they were spoken. He didn't turn. His expression didn't change. He simply stood there, feeling the coolness of the water bottle in his palm, and watched as Jessica and Mark receded toward the Innovatech building. He was used to it. Over the years, his unassuming appearance had become a kind of litmus test, a mirror that reflected the true nature of the people he encountered. Some looked right through him. Some offered a polite but distant nod. And some, like the couple who had just passed, used him to elevate themselves. He had learned not to let it affect him. But today, something felt different. A strange sense of coincidence, of a circle about to close. He took a sip of water, the coolness soothing his throat. Then, calmly, he started walking. Not toward a bus stop, but in the exact same direction as the couple. Toward the glass and steel tower of Innovatech Dynamics. As the automatic glass doors of Innovatech Dynamics slid open, Jessica and Mark stepped into another world. The air inside was cool and carried an efficient hum. The lobby was cavernous, with polished concrete walls and vibrant abstract art. Natural light flooded through massive floor-to-ceiling windows, creating a sense of space that was both immense and intimate. This wasn't just an office. It was a cathedral of innovation, an architectural statement of supreme success. Jessica took a deep breath. This was where she belonged. A young receptionist with a professional smile greeted them. "Welcome to Innovatech. How may I help you?" "Jessica Riley and Mark Sterling," Mark said, his voice exuding a practiced confidence. "We have a 2 o'clock interview with Human Resources." "Yes, of course. This way, please." They were led across the main atrium, past open-concept workspaces where engineers and designers huddled around whiteboards, deep in discussion. There were no cubicles, no rigid hierarchy. People were dressed comfortably. Jeans, t-shirts, sneakers. A sense of collaboration, a creative energy was palpable. Jessica, in her perfectly tailored business attire, and Mark, in his fitted suit, felt slightly out of place, but they quickly dismissed the feeling. They saw it as a sign of their own professionalism, a contrast to the casual messiness around them. As they sat in the plush waiting area, Jessica's eyes scanned the slogans elegantly etched into a glass wall. Innovation through empathy. Integrity in every line of code. Diverse minds, unified vision. The words were lofty, but to Jessica, they were corporate platitudes. Things companies put on display to appear socially conscious. Empathy. Integrity. Those were luxuries. In the real world, results were what mattered. Profit was the metric. Still, a vague unease began to creep into her mind. The way people interacted, the genuine smiles, the sheer diversity of races and backgrounds she saw. It seemed authentic. It didn't feel like a staged performance. It made her think of the man by the beverage cart. She wondered if he would ever have a chance to set foot in a place like this. The answer, obviously, was no. And that thought, instead of reassuring her, left a strange aftertaste. The culture of this company, with its emphasis on empathy and diverse minds, seemed to be in direct contradiction to the attitude she and Mark had displayed less than 15 minutes earlier. "They really buy into this stuff," Mark whispered, his gaze also fixed on the slogans. His voice held a note of cynical amusement, as if he were observing a strange tribe with baffling customs. "It's just branding, honey," Jessica replied, but her words lacked their usual certainty. "Every big company does it." She tried to refocus. She had prepared for this interview for weeks. She had studied every facet of Innovatech, from its product lines to its quarterly financial reports. She knew she could impress them with her knowledge and acuity. She could play the part of someone who believed in empathy if she had to. That was part of the game. But the unease remained, a low-level hum in the back of her mind, like radio static. It was a warning that she had perhaps misjudged something, not about the company, but about herself and the world she was about to enter. She was so used to seeing the world through a hierarchical lens, where everyone had their place. But here, at Innovatech, The rules seemed to be different. And for the first time in a long time, Jessica wasn't sure she truly understood the game she was about to play. Her arrogance, which had always been her strongest armor, was beginning to show tiny, invisible cracks. The conference room door opened, and a woman named Sarah from HR emerged with a warm smile. "Ms. Riley? Mr. Sterling? Please, come in." The first round of the interview went exactly as Jessica had predicted. Sarah was professional, sharp, but personable. She asked the standard questions about their experience, their accomplishments, and their management styles. Jessica and Mark took turns answering, performing as a seamless team. Jessica spoke of increasing market share by 20% for her previous company. Mark described a complex project he had completed ahead of schedule and under budget. They were confident, articulate, and charming. They could see that Sarah was impressed. Every answer was polished, every example carefully chosen to present them as ideal candidates. As Sarah nodded, jotting down a note with a look of satisfaction, Jessica felt a wave of vindication. The earlier unease had vanished, replaced by a familiar certainty. They were nailing it. They were in. "Thank you both," Sarah said, rising. "This has been very impressive. The final round will be a brief chat with our CEO. He likes to personally meet candidates for senior positions. It's a bit unorthodox, but he places a great deal of importance on culture and character." The CEO. Jessica's heart beat a little faster. Not with nerves, but with excitement. This was her chance. Impress the CEO, and the job was hers. Her and Mark's confidence peaked. They exchanged a look, a silent communication that said it all. "We've got this." "He's on his way now," Sarah said as she exited the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. "Make yourselves comfortable." They sat in expectant silence. The room offered a panoramic view of the city, a landscape of power and opportunity. "See?" Mark whispered, his smile radiant. "I told you. We were made for this." Jessica just smiled. She was already picturing her office, her name on the organizational chart, the numbers on her contract. Everything was falling perfectly into place. Then they heard footsteps approaching. It was a steady, unhurried pace. A figure appeared in the doorway. He paused for a second, backlit by the hallway light, making him a silhouette. Then he stepped into the room, and Jessica's world collapsed. It didn't collapse with a bang, but with a deafening silence. The blood seemed to drain from her face. The self-satisfied smile on her lips froze, twisting into something grotesque, a mask about to shatter. Beside her, Mark went rigid, the confident glint in his eye still lingering for a moment, before evaporating into horrified disbelief. The man standing before them was the man from the beverage cart. He was no longer in the worn hoodie. He now wore a simple but expensive tailored shirt and fitted slacks. The worn-out sneakers had been replaced by elegant leather shoes. But the face was unmistakable. The same calm eyes, the same quiet presence. Except now, that quietness wasn't that of an outsider. It was the quietness of power. He walked to the table and extended his hand, not to Mark, but to Jessica first. "Ms. Riley," he said. His voice was deep and steady, without a trace of recognition. "I'm David Hammond, CEO of Innovatech Dynamics. Thank you for coming in." Jessica stared at his outstretched hand, her mind a complete blank. Her own laughter echoed in her ears, cruel and shrill, probably waiting for his welfare check to clear. Mark's words followed, like a hammer blow on the coffin of their careers. At least he knows his place. She had thought he was the one who knew his place. But now, in this top-floor conference room, she was the one who was utterly lost. Her shock wasn't just from the coincidence. It came from the sudden, brutal realization that her entire judgment system, the entire worldview upon which she had built her career and her life, was catastrophically wrong. She had looked at a king and seen only a beggar, and she had laughed at him. After a moment that seemed to stretch into an eternity, Jessica finally regained a sliver of control. Her hand, cold as ice, reached out and took David's. "Mr. Hammond," she managed, the voice barely recognizable as her own. "It's an honor." Mark fumbled to follow suit, his handshake surprisingly weak. "Yes, a pleasure to meet you." David nodded and took the seat opposite them, his demeanor perfectly at ease. There was no triumph in his expression, no anger. He was simply professional, a cool professionalism that made the situation infinitely worse. If he had yelled or accused them, they could have defended themselves. But this calm disarmed them completely. "I've reviewed your resumes," David began, opening a folder on the table. "Very impressive. Your experience in market expansion is particularly noteworthy, Ms. Riley. And your ability to manage complex projects, Mr. Sterling, is also commendable." Jessica and Mark could only nod mechanically. His praise now sounded like mockery. "However," David continued, looking up at them, and for the first time, Jessica saw a sharp glint in his eyes. "At Innovatech, we believe the numbers on a page are only part of the story. Our culture is built on judgment, integrity, and the ability to see beyond the surface. So, I'd like to ask a few situational questions." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Ms. Riley, let's start with you. Tell me about a time you had to make a swift judgment about a person based on limited information. How did you handle it, and what was the outcome?" The question landed like a whip. It was too direct, too precise. Jessica felt her throat go dry. She stammered, trying to pull a sanitized example from her past, a pre-packaged story about a subordinate or a business partner. But every word sounded hollow, even to her own ears. Her entire being was screaming the one true answer. "An hour ago, I saw you and judged you to be a failure. And the outcome is that I am sitting here in this agony." David listened to her weak response with unwavering patience. He didn't interrupt, didn't show any sign of doubt. He simply let the silence after her answer hang in the room, amplifying the emptiness of her words. Then he turned to Mark. "Mr. Sterling, one of our core values is respect. We believe that every person, from the janitorial staff to the executive board, deserves to be treated with dignity. How do you define respect in a professional environment? And how do you ensure your teams uphold that standard?" Mark, who had always prided himself on his eloquence, found himself struggling for words. He spoke of open-door policies, of active listening, of the management jargon he had used 100 times. But as he spoke, the image of himself smirking and saying, "At least he knows his place," flashed in his mind. His words and his actions were two different worlds, and David Hammond was forcing him to confront the chasm between them. The interview continued in this fashion, a prolonged psychological torment. David never once directly mentioned their encounter outside. He didn't have to. He simply used the principles and values of Innovatech as his weapon. Every question about empathy, integrity, and judgment was a knife twisting in the wound of their hypocrisy. He had cleverly turned the interview into a mirror, forcing them to gaze at their own ugly reflection. They had come here to present their best selves, and instead, they were being forced to confront their worst. They were being stripped bare, not by accusations, but by the very standards they had pretended to embrace. Their arrogance had become the evidence against them, and the man they had scorned was now their judge, prosecutor, and jury, all in one. As the suffocating silence in the room became almost unbearable, David set the folder down on the table. He looked directly at Jessica, His gaze no longer the probing look of a CEO, but something more personal, something laden with history. "Do you remember me, Jessica?" he asked, his voice low and stripped of its corporate formality. The use of her first name, instead of Ms. Riley, was a jolt. She peered at his face, trying to find something familiar beyond the incident an hour ago. And then it came flooding back, a memory she had long since buried under layers of success and ambition. 15 years ago, a small coffee shop near their university. A young man with dreamy eyes and a notebook that was always full of wild ideas about changing the world with technology. A young man named David Hammond. They had dated for 6 months. He was brilliant, kind, and possessed a fierce passion. But to the Jessica of that time, passion didn't pay the bills. He was a dreamer, while she needed a pragmatist. She remembered their breakup. "David, I need stability," she had said, her words cool and decisive. "Your ideas are wonderful, but they're not a career plan. I can't bet my future on dreams." He had looked at her, not with anger, but with a deep sadness in his eyes. "I think they're more than dreams," was all he had said. Jessica had walked away and never looked back. She had chosen a safer path, a path that led to Mark, who had a clear career trajectory and a solid family background. She told herself she had made the smart choice, the adult decision. She had dismissed David as a youthful folly, a closed chapter. But now, that chapter was open right in front of her, and the story had a radically different ending. The dreamer with no future, whom she had cast aside, was now sitting in the highest seat of power, in a company built from the very ideas she had scorned. Her insult to him outside the building wasn't just a random act of condescension. It was a repetition, a painful echo of the same misjudgment she had made 15 years ago. She hadn't just misjudged a stranger on the street. She had misjudged the very man she once knew, again, and in the exact same way. Mark looked from Jessica to David, his face a mask of confusion and dawning suspicion. "You two, you know each other?" Jessica couldn't speak. She felt as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. This shock was greater than the CEO reveal. This was a personal reckoning. David wasn't just a potential boss they had offended. He was a ghost from her past, a living reminder of her own short-sightedness. The entire narrative she had told herself about her own wisdom and judgment had just gone up in flames. She had built her life on making the right choices, and now she was faced with the undeniable proof that her most critical decision might have been a catastrophic mistake. David saw the recognition in her eyes. He didn't need to say another word. His presence, his success, was the most eloquent accusation. He simply sat there, a testament to all she had lost and all she had failed to see. Her arrogance hadn't just cost her a job opportunity. It had forced her to confront the fact that she had thrown away a remarkable man because he didn't fit her narrow definition of success. And the pain of that truth was more bitter than any professional rejection. Seeing his wife's silent collapse, a different feeling began to rise in Mark. Indignation. He didn't feel remorse for his actions. He felt ambushed. He looked at David, then back at Jessica, and in his mind, a different narrative began to form. This wasn't an interview. This was a personal vendetta. David was using his position to humiliate his wife, and by extension, him. Mark's protective instincts kicked in. He was the provider, the man of the house. He wasn't going to sit by and let someone from his wife's past destroy their future. He decided it was time to reclaim control. "Look, Hammond," Mark began, his tone taking on a false familiarity, an attempt to bring David down to his level. "It's clear there's some kind of history here. but I think it's completely inappropriate to bring personal matters into a professional setting like this. David merely arched an eyebrow. Everything we do is personal, Mr. Sterling. The way we treat a stranger on the street is just as personal as how we lead a board meeting. Do you disagree? What I mean is, Mark pressed on, feeling his footing slip. We came here to interview for a job. We're qualified. Our resumes prove that. Whatever happened outside was a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding, David repeated, his voice still calm. Then help me understand. When you say someone knows his place, what, precisely, is that place? Mark's confidence began to fracture. He wasn't used to being questioned like this. He was used to being the one in charge. It was an off-the-cuff remark, he said, his tone turning defensive. A joke. You can't judge a person by a single joke. Oh, I couldn't agree more, David replied, the faintest hint of a smile touching his lips. I'm not judging you by the joke. I'm judging you by how you're answering my questions right now. You're being evasive, Mr. Sterling. Let's talk about your resume. It says here you led a project with an emphasis on teamwork and collaboration. Your actions an hour ago don't seem very team-oriented. Can you reconcile that contradiction for me? Mark was stunned. David was using the words from his own resume against him. He felt cornered, every escape route cut off. His manufactured confidence, built on paper achievements and corporate buzzwords, was rapidly dissolving in the face of true power and intellectual sharpness. He was accustomed to a world where appearances were everything, but David was seeing right through the facade, to the emptiness within. In a final, desperate bid to assert himself, Mark leaned forward, his voice dropping to a barely concealed threat. What do you think you're doing? You're abusing your power. This could have unpleasant consequences for you and this company. David didn't flinch. He just looked at Mark, his gaze as cool and steady as steel. The only consequences I see here, Mr. Sterling, are the consequences of your own choices. My company was built on the principle that character matters more than skill. We can train for skill. We cannot train for character. And right now, you are giving me a very clear demonstration of yours. Mark sank back in his chair, utterly defeated. He had played his last card, the threat, and it had been useless. He had nothing left. The polished exterior, the confident voice, it was all a hollow shell. And David Hammond had just shattered it with a hammer. He hadn't just failed to salvage the situation. He had made it exponentially worse, exposing his true nature. A bully who was only strong when facing those he perceived as weaker. After a silence that cemented Mark's defeat, David Hammond stood up. The movement was final, signaling that the conversation was over. He looked at Jessica, then at Mark, his expression no longer probing, just clear and cold. Thank you both for your time, he said, the professional tone returning. But now it carried a different weight. Unfortunately, after this conversation, I don't believe you are the right fit for the culture at Innovatech Dynamics. The words, though expected, landed like a sentence. Jessica finally found her voice, a weak and desperate whisper. David, please. It was a terrible mistake. He held up a hand, a small but powerful gesture that stopped her. This isn't about that mistake, Jessica. Not entirely. That mistake was just a symptom. The real issue is the disease behind it. The arrogance, the judgment, the belief that a person's worth is determined by the clothes they wear or the money in their bank account. He walked toward the window, looking out at the city below. I built this company from nothing, on ideas that people like you once dismissed as dreams. I succeeded not by tearing people down, but by believing in their potential even when no one else did. The culture here is founded on respect. Not respect for titles or for wealth, but a fundamental respect for human beings. He turned back to face them. Your actions outside weren't just a thoughtless joke. They showed me how you see the world. They showed me that when you think no one important is watching, you choose cruelty over kindness. And someone who does that cannot lead a team here. They cannot inspire innovation. They cannot build trust. He paused, letting his words sink in. The positions you're applying for require exceptional judgment. Yet you have demonstrated a profound lack of it. Not because you didn't recognize me, but because you would treat any stranger that way in the first place. David walked to the door and opened it. I am not rejecting you because of our past, Jessica, and I'm not rejecting you because of what you said outside. I am rejecting you because of what you've demonstrated right here, in this room, for the last 15 minutes. You've shown no remorse, only fear. You've shown no integrity, only excuses. You have failed the most important test. He looked them squarely in the eyes, one at a time. This job opportunity is denied. I suggest you take this time to reflect, not on the job you lost, but on why you lost it. Dignity and respect are not things you can put on for an interview. They are who you are, and that is an asset no amount of money can buy. With that, he walked out of the room, leaving the door open. Jessica and Mark sat frozen in the humiliating silence. There was nothing left to say. There was nothing left to do. They had arrived as conquerors, confident of their place at the top of the world. They now left as failures, exposed as not just unqualified, but unworthy. Their failure wasn't a random event. It was the direct, inescapable consequence of who they were. The drive home was shrouded in a heavy silence, more suffocating than any argument. The luxury car, once a symbol of their success, now felt like a moving coffin. Jessica stared out the window, but she didn't see the passing scenery. She only saw her own reflection, a woman whose perfect makeup now looked like a cracked mask. Mark gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if it were the only enemy he could confront. It was Mark who finally broke the silence, his voice hoarse with suppressed rage. Why didn't you tell me you knew him? The question was irrational, but it was all he had. Blame. I haven't seen him in 15 years, Mark, Jessica replied, her voice hollow. How could I have known? You should have recognized him, he roared, slamming his hand on the wheel. This whole thing, it's your fault. His personal grudge against you ruined everything. Jessica turned to look at her husband, and for the first time, she saw him clearly, not through a lens of admiration or love, but in stark reality. She saw a weak man, a man so incapable of facing his own failure that he had to find someone else to blame. No, Mark, she said, her voice surprisingly cold. This isn't my fault. This is on us. We did it. We said those words. He just showed us who we really are. That admission, spoken aloud, was a terrible thing. It stripped them of their last excuse. They were not victims of a vendetta. They were the architects of their own downfall. The illusion of the power couple, of their superiority over the world, had evaporated. All that was left were two small, frightened people, sitting in an expensive car that couldn't hide the emptiness inside. Mark had failed to protect her. Jessica had failed to lead them to success. The very foundation of their relationship, a shared arrogance, a mutual belief in their own exceptionalism, was destroyed. And without it, they had nothing left to say to each other. The silence returned, but this time it was worse. It was filled with unspoken accusations, bitter regret, and the dawning, sickening realization that the crack that had just appeared between them might never be repaired. They had laughed together at a stranger, and now They couldn't even look each other in the eye. Jessica and Mark's wrongful actions stemmed not from a single source, but a confluence of complex psychological factors. At its core was a deep-seated insecurity. They needed to constantly reinforce their own sense of self-worth by diminishing others. By labeling David a failure, they could temporarily feel more successful, more superior. Their relationship seemed to be built on this fragile foundation, an alliance against a world they believed they were better than. This was compounded by confirmation bias. They saw a casually dressed black man and immediately projected onto him all the negative stereotypes society had fed them, rather than seeing him as an individual. The consequences could have been mitigated had they acted differently. If, upon realizing their error, Jessica or Mark had shown genuine remorse instead of making excuses and shifting blame, the story might have changed. A direct apology, acknowledging their misjudgment and lack of respect, might not have gotten them the jobs, but it would have salvaged a piece of their dignity. If Jessica had said, "David, I was wrong, not just today but 15 years ago. My judgment was clouded by shallow prejudices. I am sorry," she could have begun a process of healing, at least for her own soul. The lessons from this story are profound. First, character is not a coat you can put on and take off. It is who you are in the small moments, when you think no one is judging you. The world is smaller than we think, and your smallest actions can create ripples that reach unexpected shores. Second, true respect is never contingent on status, wealth, or appearance. It is a basic human right. To judge others through a lens of prejudice is not only to do them a disservice, but to blind yourself to truth, to opportunity, and to the remarkable people who might change your life. The final message for all of us is to live a life of consistency. Be the same person in the boardroom and on the sidewalk. Treat the CEO and the janitor with the same degree of respect. Because in the end, your true worth isn't measured by what you achieve, but by how you treat those who can do nothing for you. That is the ultimate measure of a person. I'd like to ask you all a couple of questions. What would you have done in David's position? And do you believe in second chances for people like Jessica and Mark? Please share your thoughts in the comments below.